Hey folks, Alan Mandic, the Hot Rod Hippie here. This video we're going to be rebuilding the door hinges on a 1965 C10 build. Now this applies to more than just this C10. A lot of vehicles use this very similar design of door hinge, and also there's some whys as to why we're doing this beyond the obvious ones, and also some tips and tricks that I do when I'm rebuilding hinges that you might find useful in here. So let's check it out. So first and foremost, you see this glowing box around me. It's because I'm coming to you from my streaming setup right now. The rest of my office is a little bit tied up with projects that you folks will see in the not too distant future, but I don't have the space to be filming where I normally would at the moment. So let's move on and let's lose this box right now. What we're talking about today is the C10 door hinges, what we're rebuilding anyway. And this applies to more than just C10, so don't just think, C10, that's nothing to do with me. GM muscle cars, Ford trucks and cars, Dodges, even some import cars. Back into street rod territory, I've experienced most of these things run a very similar design of door hinge. So what I'm going to show you and talk about, along with the special tips and tricks that I'm going to throw in here, are going to apply to various vehicles, not just C10s. So stick around and find out how this might apply to your project. So first and foremost, let's talk about why we're going to rebuild hinges. There are two common reasons why you're going to be ending up doing this. They're pretty obvious: looseness and tightness. On the C10 build, when I tried to close the door on the passenger side of this thing, it was stopping like halfway. It was dragging so hard on the hinges that it made opening and closing them difficult. This can actually be more of a problem than just the annoyance of that being tight. It can also cause things to be so tight that they cause bind and twisting. I've had it in the past where sometimes where a door hinge was so tight, it was causing the inner structure of the door to flex on me, or the B-pillar even on some weaker designed vehicles. And that can cause some serious fit and finish issues when you're trying to fit components. The other obvious reason is looseness, where you have a door that has play in it, where you can literally grab at the end of it and wiggle it. I mean, many of us have had vehicles in the past where you had to do that to get the door to latch, pick up on the thing. It's annoying. You don't want to be doing that if you're trying to restore a vehicle. And honestly, this is a simple thing you can do to just fix up something and make it feel and seem more premium in the end. Even if you're not going for a show car, having doors that just open and close nicely is a huge thing on a vehicle. And of course, that looseness can also cause other problems, such as your door riding on your rocker panel or rubbing on your B-pillar. The last thing you want to do is restore a vehicle and then get it all together and realize you got a little sag in your door hinges and it contacts your B-pillar after your fresh paint job is done. That is just awful and not something anybody wants to go through. So I always recommend, when you start on a door area of a vehicle, replace or repair your door hinges. Even if you think they're in good shape, I almost always, on every project I do, rebuild the door hinges, because it's just good to start from a good starting point, make sure everything is nice and clean. And there's a few things that I do to door hinges we're going to talk about in here that I think really helps to clean up a vehicle when you're not talking about strict restoration where it's got to stay the same. Now, obviously with looseness, you can also run into a situation where things are so loose that you're kind of up a creek and you need new hinges, or you need to sleeve it or put oversized bushings in because the holes are egged out, hogged out, oversized now. And even just putting a new pin and bushing in is not going to tighten things up the way you need them to. That's a whole different animal than what I'm going to talk about in this video, unfortunately. If you have a situation like that and you're not quite sure what to do, you can't find replacements or the oversized bushings, hit me up and I'll try and help you out with that as best as I can. You don't want to be fighting yourself when you're restoring a car. Give yourself every advantage that you can. You don't want to have that saggy door on there because I can just work on this now until I get the new door hinges in and I'll adjust it better later. You don't want to be doing that. You want to work with the products and the hinges and the parts that you're going to be working with when you assemble the car. You never know what differences there might be in the hinges that you're going to get, or what differences that play is causing you're not realizing. I've fought myself trying to adjust out of whack doors before because the hinges were just a little bit too worn out and I didn't quite realize it until it was too late. So that's the why. Let's talk about actually doing this project. Let's go ahead and break things down. In a restoration situation, disassemble things. It's going to save you so much headache and trouble in the long run. Yes, it's annoying to reset all the hinges back where you need to be, but in the same regard, when you rebuild hinges, more often than not, you need to adjust the location of the hinges anyway. And some of the steps that I'm going to show you will save you headaches in the long run for that, so it just makes sense to fully disassemble things in my experience. Now, once we have everything broken down, we have the hinges off the vehicle, it's time to head to the workbench and start messing with them free and open away from the vehicle. Now, the first step is to assess what you have, take a look at it, and then start to break it down. On the C10 door hinges, it's a very simple design. Two halves come together with a pin and bushings in between. Very often you'll find the bushings are destroyed, worn out, or gone. Now, the first thing you'll notice about the hinges that I got off of the C10 here is, well, they're crusty, they're rusty, they're just ugly and messy, and that's one of the things we're going to address here. This is something that people try to avoid. I hate taking hinges off, I don't want to do that. But look how much rust was hiding behind the hinge on the A-pillar of this vehicle. If we left these things alone, even if we just loosened them up and moved them, this would have eventually caused rust and destroyed the restoration that we're doing here. It is so worth your time to break things down, clean them up, and do the job right now. It'll save you so much trouble in the long run. To break down a door hinge into its base components is so very simple. The simplest brute force method is always what I end up using. Break it down by hammering the heck out of it with a socket and a drift punch. Now, I have to admit, the ones on the C10 were actually pretty darn stubborn, so this kind of plays into the tightness of the hinges that we had here. When you have ones that are tight, it's often because rust formed inside the pin and bushing area, creating a little bit of a swelling effect and tightening everything up, which also means that disassembling the components, because they are a press fit, sort of, that it just becomes a bigger headache. It's a lot of hammering, a lot of beating on this thing to drive it out. I use a socket underneath the head of the pin itself, and then come up from the top side or put it into a vise and just hammer that pin out of there. If you have access to a press, you could possibly use a press setup for this, but getting a press drive pin that's small enough to actually push on the bushing, I never really have much luck with that, so I just usually use the hammer method more often than not. The fun thing about this is that I decided to film redoing these on the C10, and honestly, these fought me more than most vehicles ever do. I rebuild the hinges on pretty much everything I restore because I find that it is a simple way to make a more premium finished product, and the C10 did not want to come apart on this thing, but we got the job done. Feel like it's just that nature of having a camera on you, things aren't going to go your way. Once we got the pin out, you can see the two halves of the actual door hinge, the component structure of them. You've got the pin, you've got bushings, and you've got the two halves of the hinges themselves. Now, the bushings inside of there can be a plastic material, but more often in classic vehicles, there's something like a bronze bushing that's in there. So a metal that has its own lubricating properties to it for some give, as well as smooth motion and not to be noisy. If your bushings are a little bit stubborn, you can get back in behind them once the pin is out with a drift punch or something and drive them out that way. More often than not, they're going to come out pretty easily because things are so worn that that shouldn't be much of an issue if your bushings are even left. It's not uncommon at all to have at least the head of the bushing be gone and the actual neck of the bushing could still be there. You'll run into that pretty often. So the first thing that I do after disassembly is clean things. Now, my preferred method is go to a blast cabinet, a media blaster, and blast these things clean. Unfortunately, my dad's garage, we don't have a media blaster, so I had to do it by hand with a DA and a die grinder and do my best to clean up every surface of these things that I can. I find personally that door hinges are some of the worst constructed components on a vehicle. The actual hinge where they meet together and the pin goes through, that's all fine-ish. But the rest of the hinge, it's almost always these really rough and nasty edges. It's just sheared off pieces. Simply clean them up. Sand the edges smooth instead of having the rough flash edges from cutting or casting. Clean them up the best that you can. Now, there's more to cleaning these up than just the aesthetic factor of it. Now, that is obviously a factor, but there's also the usability standpoint. When you go to adjust these things, what I like to do is I like to round off all the edges on those hinges. This not only makes them look much better than those really rough, either cast or sheared off edges they usually have, but it also makes it so they slide and move easier on your door and your A-pillar, sorry. Actually, if you have suicide doors, it could be your B-pillar. I've had numerous times in my career where I went to adjust a door and it just didn't want to move. All the bolts were loose and it's like, this makes no sense. It should move. There's nothing holding it. I had to get a pry bar behind it to kind of break it free of the pillar or the door skin, and then it would start to move. Those rough edges kind of help that happen. They help to bite in and hold things in place, which might be okay once you get it where you want it to be, but getting it to that point is far more difficult in my opinion. I'm telling you, next time you look at a vehicle, take a look at the door hinges on them. See if anybody bothered to clean them up, if they're factory rough castings or rough stock that they used on them. Or are they cleaned up that little bit? Are the edges radiused off? Are they nice and smooth? I find that that really makes things look better in the long run, at least in my opinion. Now comes time to actually assemble these things. I have the new pins and bushings here. You can see I've got those bronze bushings there and the new pins, but the new pins are longer than the original ones. This is something you'll often run into. The help section of your local parts store or ordering online may have bushings and pins that are going to work for you, but they might be too long for you. Too long is fine, too short is not. Now, when everything's right, your bronze bushings should actually tap in. Now, they shouldn't be too difficult to tap in, but they shouldn't just go in and fall out. I can't really tell you how much play is too much play in this type of situation. You'll probably get a feel for it as you're going. You do have to remember that a little bit of play is okay. There needs to be some give in things so that you're not causing a bind situation when it's all assembled together. You do have two hinges working independent of each other, and they might be in slightly different positions, so that play can allow for that difference in position, whereas being super tight, they would have to be like rod straight together, and that's difficult to achieve in most applications. Now it's as simple as just putting the two halves of the hinges together and pushing the pin through them. You will reach down to the knurl of the pin, which needs to be driven into place so that it all holds together properly. But here I mentioned that these pins are too long. So what am I going to do here? Simple, cut them off. That's really all I need to do. I cut them off with a cutoff wheel and then sand the edge so they have a nice tapered end to them. Not only so they look good, but also so they go through the bushings without damaging, scratching, or scraping things up. And that is it for rebuilding door hinges. It is such a simple concept. There are a couple of things that I think make a vehicle a premium step up. I've done vehicles where we weren't restoring it. We were just making a nice driver for a customer. It wasn't rotten or anything, so we could fix up the engine, get it driving better. And this is one of those things I might still do to that vehicle. It just makes it so the doors open and close nicer. The other thing that I find most people skip and really should do is weather stripping around their doors and windows. It is amazing how much of a premium difference it makes when your windows and your doors aren't rattling around and everything closes really nice and satisfying. But that's a whole different topic. Now, I filmed all of this very early on working on the C10 build, so I didn't actually put the doors right back on after I rebuilt the hinges, because it was easier to work on the truck with the doors out of my way for now. It was much further down the line that I reinstalled the doors and gapped them and did all of that, and that's a whole separate topic. But reinstallation is just the reverse of the installation, and giving you tips on adjusting hinges, that probably needs to be a dedicated video. And that's going to wrap it up for this video, folks. It's a simple concept, rebuilding hinges, but I just wanted to show you the hands-on practice of doing it so you could see how I approach it and some of those techniques that I use when I'm doing it that maybe some other people don't. All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please go ahead and drop it a like. It really helps out. Let me know in the comments down below. Have you rebuilt the hinges on your project yet? Do you need to do it? Let me know in the comments down below. Patreon.com/HotRodHippie, that directly supports this channel so I can do more hands-on video content for you folks, and get subscribed to keep up to date with all the HotRodHippie content. Thanks for coming around.